Okay, now we're ready for a representative democracy, which is by far the more prevalent type. And the tricky thing about representative democracy is that in terms of format, in terms of structure, it's indistinguishable from a republic. They're going to look just the same. And I've known a few people who insisted that representative democracy is a republic, straight up. You can't really draw a distinction. I'm going to draw one, but it's real slippery. It has to do not with the structure, but shall we say with the principles, with the expectation. If the government structured like that, if the government is seen as existing for the purpose of, as a high school government textbook I used once long ago poetically put it, translating the public will into public policy in the form of law, in other words, carrying out the will of the people, then it's representative democracy. If, on the other hand, the legislators, we're talking about people electing legislators to Congress, to the legislature, to the commissioners court, if they tend to see this as being paternalistic rulers who are following their own predispositions, then it's a republic. So you can see the difference is slippery and vague. But there you go. Sometimes I use a weird little example to show how it really kind of comes out. Okay, let's imagine that you're all grown up and you have the means to pursue this, and you are a Democrat to the bone. Big D, small d, every kind of D you can think of, you are a Democrat, flat out. Now, you seek election to, let's say, the United States House of Representatives, and you are determined, and you assure the voters that if elected, you will be the people's representative. You will carry out the will of the people, whatever it may be. All right, let's say you get elected. Now, you moved into your office, you got your staff working for you, all of that. Now, what do you got to do? Now, you got to find out what the will of the people is so you can follow orders. So, you got people reading every letter that comes in from people in your district. You got people monitoring the newspaper editorials and letters to the editor and the call-in shows in your district. You listen carefully to anybody that comes by your office to tell you what to think. Phone calls, faxes, emails, all of that. You are finding out what the people want. Now, what do you suppose you're going to find out? Is there really a will of the people? The people? No. Do you know how many constituents you have? If you're a member of Congress, the people who populate your district are your constituents. Now, since they have to be averaged out across the country as much as possible, other than about 6 states that don't even have as many people as a congressional district, you represent about 800,000 people. That's a lot of people. You're going to find every shade of opinion in your district. You're going to find people that want to confiscate all the firearms and melt them down. You're going to have people in your district that are fierce defenders of Second Amendment gun rights. You're going to have people in your district who believe that doctors who perform abortions should be sent to prison for murder. You're going to have people in your district think every woman ought to have 2 abortions. And it just goes on from there. You're going to find that most of the people in your district couldn't answer the question, who's your congressman, if they had a gun to their head. So most of them don't know who you are, couldn't name you. Could you name your representative in Congress? Could you? Think about it. So you're going to be forced to the conclusion that there is no will of the people most of the time. Rarely might there be. But there's a whole other angle here. You're a freshman congressperson. You're a member of a political party That political party is organized in the House of Representatives. It has elected leaders. And if you want your legislation to be considered, you're going to have to vote the way they tell you on some occasions. If they need your vote, you better line up, or your bill is not going to get anywhere. I'm starting to make sense here. Okay, so it's like when you just got there, maybe even later on, you don't necessarily represent your district, you represent the district of somebody that's more powerful. Or you don't even represent districts, nobody really does. So this is not just the Democrats. It might be more the Democrats than the Republicans. Both parties are organized, and both parties attempt to exercise at least some form of discipline. So other than having to do what the party leaders tell you, even sometimes if it means putting your head on the chopping block as far as getting reelected, you're gonna vote just the way you think you ought to. You're gonna come full circle, okay? You're gonna go to D.C. Bound and determined to represent the will of the people, and you find out the people can't actually be said to have a will, so you just vote on legislation according to your own lights, or at most the way you think most of them would want you to vote. Okay? So that's kind of how it comes out. Is the United States a republic or a democracy? Good question. It was certainly intended to be a republic. A lot of people assume that it is a democracy, but even that is more theory than fact. And it ends up kind of being back around as more a republic than a democracy, even with the people who want it to be a democracy. So, all right, so now you're kind of grounded in this. How did views of democracy change in the first part of the 19th century? Remember that in the days when the Constitution was being written, the Federalist era, Federalists and pretty much Republicans too did not have a positive view of democracy for the most part. The word left a bad taste in one's mouth. There's an anecdote involving Martha Washington. She was the first lady, and the story goes that maybe she was supervising a cleanup of the room where the president used to have his reception once a week and go around and shake people's hands. She observed that somebody had left a greasy handprint on the wallpaper. Mrs. Washington was shocked. Nice people do not leave greasy handprints on the wallpaper. Somebody wrote down for us what remark she made when she made this shocking observation. It could only have been left there, she said, by a, quote, filthy Democrat, unquote. If you're a Democrat, don't be offended. There's not a Democrat Party yet. Small d. She just associated people who believed in democracy with like the common people. You'd be surprised, I might be surprised too, how deeply this penetrated. Let's say you were born in somewhat humble circumstances in your county, and you've lived long and prospered, and you've made some money, and you've climbed socially, and you think about running for maybe the legislature or something. There'd be a time when your neighbors would not like that at all. Who do you think you are putting on there as being better than us? They don't mind the people born to that doing it. It's like they're supposed to. So, anyway, by the 1820s, the wind is changing rapidly. For one thing, the Panic of 1819 has been the proverbial two-by-four upside the head to get it across to apathetic people that the policies of the national government really do matter. So, and people increasingly want their say. So by the 1820s, we're moving rapidly toward the idea of the republic going out of style and the idea of democracy coming into style. This is part of a larger movement over a very broad base going on for quite some time, a kind of general rebellion against authority or pretensions of authority in all its forms. When full grown, it will be where the point where if you just dress too nicely, if you're too grammatical, if you're too well educated, too qualified for office, the new voters are going to give you thumbs down. You know that. And they didn't believe in doctors. You know, they make up all these phony Latin words to hide the fact they really don't know diddly squat. It's kind of a big deal. All right. During the 1820s, mainly, well, by the end of the 1820s, let me put it that way, a number of changes, and I will list 5 of them, reflect this trend toward making the system more inclusive, more democratic than it was meant to be, or at least on the surface. Okay? There's a potential essay question about this. They could take either of 2 forms. In both forms, and it's two possible questions, you need to tell which one you're attempting to answer. In one form, it would be how these changes reflected democratic assumptions as opposed to Republican assumptions. And I'm talking about, basic definitions, lowercase r and d, not uppercase. The other form of the question, and you still have to know what the 5 were, how did this impact politics? How the game of politics is played. A lot of meat on the bone both ways. Okay. If they could be taken in a kind of hierarchy, I'm going to say the first one we're going to talk about, number 1, is these are characteristics of the new democracy, and that is states eliminated the property qualification for voting. All right, and that is known. That's a phenomenon known as manhood suffrage. It was white manhood suffrage, but it's manhood suffrage. Now, suffrage, what's that? Remember, about 100 years after that and 100 years before us, a big controversy was woman suffrage. Suffrage is the right to vote. Didn't all men have the right to vote? Well, no. Originally, all the states, all 13 original states, limited the vote to people who owned minimum amounts, at least, of property. You had to prove that you were a property owner. It would be defined on the taxable property above a certain amount. Why was that? That was based on, it's not necessarily elitist, just based on the assumption that, very much part of a republic, that unless you're financially independent, you cannot be politically independent. And we don't want you voting unless you can cast an independent vote free from any external restraint. If you're an employee working for the man, this is before anybody invented a secret ballot, your vote is public, he could pressure you to vote the way he wants you to. And you might just have to do that. There are also, early model street gangs that would try to intimidate you. You are vulnerable to bribery and intimidation. So, none of the new states, when they started being added, had that qualification. Because in the new states, property ownership was so nearly universal, it's like a distinction without a difference. So one by one, states dropped that. It is believed that some of the original states dropped it, did away with it very grudgingly, because they're concerned about people picking up and moving out to western states like Illinois or Kentucky or somewhere where they don't have a requirement. Here's the deal. When voting, the right to vote was fairly restricted, it was a mark of social distinction to be a voter. If you're a voter, you walk a little taller and talk a little louder. So, and out west, every man's a voter. Now, you don't know till you get there that if everybody's a voter, it's not a mark of distinction anymore. But in order to take away one allurement of the western states, states began doing away with it. By 1828, I think it was, only South Carolina still had that. Some states that had been not real, the property meant real estate, except in a couple of states it would be tools of a trade. And some states substituted what's called a poll tax. You had to pay a tax in order to vote, and that was intended to filter out the very poorest men. In later times, as late as the early 1960s, it had been to discourage black people from voting. I'll take this up in the next part.